I live in one of the largest cities of Ontario, about 4 or 5 blocks from the edge of it. We do see a handful of wildlife, mostly small, with deer and coyotes being the largest, with bears being very rare, maybe once every 5 years. I live in the opposite end of the dump, in a very residential area with only a handful of small restaurants. I say this because there should be no reason for this specific smell in my area or how strong it is, since there are so few food containing dumpsters. In the past year, a lot of strange things have happened to and around me, mostly just harmless, weird things. Last month, that changed. I felt something predatory outside my home, something that put me in full fight or flight. It went on for a few days, and I recorded what I could of that event. It will be in a separate post as it is a lot of text and information. Whatever it was stopped for a while, and I felt comfortable being out at night again. I prefer to cycle when it's late at night as it's calm, empty, and it feels natural to me. So I started to bike again, and that's when I first started to notice it. The smell. It started with a smell like rotting meat. I'd pass houses and it would just hit me. I initially thought maybe it was my breath, or some people had rotting trash, or even an unusual amount of roadkill if I just couldn't see. But I kept smelling it all over the city. Then one night, that predatory feeling happened again, and I stopped being out at night for a while, just waiting to see if that feeling would stay or not. It didn't, so I started cycling again. This time, those same areas that smelled of rotting meat now smelled far worse. It was maybe 1 in 15 to 20 houses, but it was awful. It seemed like a dead freezer full of meat that had been sitting outside and sealed for weeks. Worse than the food waste bins behind grocery stores and the like. All the time, I thought it was probably just a local dump in the wind until a friend mentioned the smell too, saying it was like a dumpster full of expired meat. She made note of how it only comes out at night and seems to be coming from houses specifically. She also lives too far away from the dump for her to smell it. That's when I made the connections. After hearing my friend's comments, I decided I would try to verify this, try to locate the areas the smell was coming from specifically. I started to walk my sibling's dog to the areas that I noticed the smell. About 30 minutes away from where I lived, the dog would start acting weird. He would sniff the air and start pulling down certain roads until I would start to smell that now familiar scent. As it would get stronger, the dog would start to puff up as if he was feeling threatened. This went on for a few nights until the dog became too difficult to walk, unusually so. On the last walk, I took him in a direction I had not noticed that smell, keeping relatively close to my neighborhood. All was fine until we started walking back when we cut through a park, and he stopped dead. His fur was raised and he kept huffing the air. I smelled it too. We were about 3 blocks from home and the smell was so strong. It had to be one of the houses that backed onto the park. I wanted to get closer, but the dog refused to go further. I should mention that this was a lit park that was quite open with a paved footpath going straight through it. There was nothing unusual I could see. But I turned around anyway, and the dog followed quickly with his fur on end and tail tucked. We went around the long way back home. This bothered me, but I didn't feel threatened or scared, just uncomfortable with the smell and the dog's behaviour. Then the other night, around 3 a.m., I woke up to the dog pacing in the hallway. I figured he needed out to do his business, so I tried to lead him outside, only he seemed hesitant. I got him out the door and he immediately turned around and whined to be let back in. I stepped out to check on him and he calmed down a bit, but he stayed by the door. I brought him back inside and went back to bed since I couldn't do much else and I was tired. Now tonight, the dog is being excessively clingy, and when I went out to put some recycling in the bins, I smelled that rotting stench. Not too strong, but definitely enough to concern me. enough to make me want more input from people who might be less dismissive or have ideas or thoughts to what is causing this. I'm not sure what to think. Maybe I'm being paranoid, but this was a distinct smell that should not be this common. It couldn't have just been excessive trash in people's homes without more people noticing. I thought carry on, but again, it's too common a smell. I considered maybe it was the dump, but that's too far away to be smelled where I live. Maybe it's something rational, but if it's not, I really have no idea as to where to even begin considering what it could be. Also, I'm still not able to confirm which houses specifically the smell seems to originate from. I can narrow it down to about a 5 house area along a street, but it could also be from those houses' backyard neighbours on the next streets over. To begin, I'd like to give some context behind this story. My girlfriend and I are on vacation to the Oregon coast this week. The weather hasn't been amazing, so we've just been exploring around random roads, shops, and beaches, seeing what we can see. Keep in mind, through the duration of the story, that I'm from the Rocky Mountains, so I have a pretty good sense of direction, having driven many winding mountain roads. Today, we were driving north on the coastal highway, looking for beaches to explore, when I spotted a small road, which turned out to be a Forest Service road. On a whim, I decided to drive up it. The road was narrow, barely one lane, but paved for the first mile or so. The road wound up and down a large hillside, moving steadily northward. For those unfamiliar, the forests on the Oregon coast are very dense, dark, and filled with ferns and other underbrush. The trees are nearly branchless, save for small broken twigs until the very top, where there is a dense canopy. In itself, this makes for fairly creepy forests. Aside from this, today, the woods were almost deadly silent, with only the chirping of the occasional bird or chittering of a squirrel, but eerily quiet. We stopped several times just to take pictures and venture a few yards into the woods and look around. By the time we hit the gravel part of the road, the sun was starting to set and a thick fog had rolled over the forest, obscuring anything beyond about 30 yards. Both of us began to feel a bit uneasy at this, but continued driving as the road began to slope back down. We assumed it would let back onto the highway. In another 10 minutes or so, with the road still sloping down and edging north across many switchbacks, we came to a fork in the road. The right fork veered off to the east and the left to the west. We played rock, paper, scissors to decide which direction to go and ended up heading to the right. A few turns later, the road took a sharp turn northward. As we came around the corner, we saw the front end of a red SUV sticking up out of a ditch. It appeared to have slid off and rotated with the front pointing nearly vertical. It looked recent, but was abandoned. At first glance, the vehicle seemed undamaged, but as I looked, I noticed a huge dent on the driver's side. This wasn't all that strange, except there was nothing near the car that could have caused it. No stumps, logs, boulders, nothing. I decided not to overthink the strangely placed dent, or the wreck in general, and assumed the owners had gotten a ride, and maybe the dent was from an older accident. We continued on down the road, not thinking too much of it. After about 30 minutes, we hit pavement again and eventually the highway. I turned the car onto the highway and took a right, as we were headed north to find a beach, after all. That was when I realised that I had seen some of the signs on the side of the road before. My girlfriend and I both started feeling very weird at this point, like deja vu, but it wasn't until we passed the entrance to the exact road we had just driven up that it dawned on us. After nearly an hour of driving roughly north, we re-entered the highway nearly 5 miles south of where we began. Laying here in bed a few hours later, writing this, I still cannot figure out how this happened, but I can't find the road on maps or anything, And I'm sure we never veered even a little south. I don't know what was going on up that road, but it still feels like a Twilight Zone episode hours later. I think I saw a ghost when I was 6 or 7. If it's not one, then it was definitely not human, and I still have no explanation of what it was. I was 6 or 7 in my house. I still live in the same house today. It was late afternoon. My family had 2 maids in the house at the time. It may seem excessive, and it's pretty weird to explain, but in Indonesia during that time in the mid 2000s, having 1 or 2 maids who live with you was rather the norm in the cities. As I understand it, it's also the norm in other big cities in Southeast Asian countries like the Philippines and Malaysia. But a generally recognized fact is also how it's really, really hard to find a maid who's going to stick and felt comfortable to work and live with you for a long time. Yet when you finally find the one maid, she's going to be willing to work with your family for a long, long time. Like for generations until they're really old. This was also the case for my family. We had 2 maids at the time. One maid had stayed with us for about 12 years. Yet we had difficulties finding another one that would enjoy working with us as well. All of them usually quit after a year or two, some even after 6 months. That being said, as a 7-year-old, I could recount a dozen different maids that used to live with us. I was also especially very close to some of them. Those who are close to us sometimes like to come and visit our family there, just to catch up and chat. Now, after explaining that context, back to the story. I cringe when I remember it now, but I was a very artistic child. As a 7-year-old, I liked to hold fictional concerts and pretend I was a famous singer or whatever. I would be really into it and thought myself was Celine Dion or something like that. One day, something that I particularly liked doing was holding a fictional concert in my front yard. I can remember that I used to do it a lot, always in the afternoon. But one particular day, it was especially late in the afternoon. So not long after I started swinging while twirling and dancing and whatever, it started turning dark. As a kid, I didn't care, I think. I just kept singing, really loudly, while looking at the sky as if there were stage lights coming from there. I also didn't really worry because I wasn't outside of the house. The front yard was still within our fence. Also, the front yard wasn't particularly big either. It's only big enough for you to park a car. Between the yard and my house door, we have a garage. The garage is wide open, as well as my front house door. All lights were turned on inside the house, and as soon as you step foot inside your house, you immediately were looking towards my one maid and my mom chatting loudly while cooking a bunch of food. The TV's on and the sound filled the whole living room. Basically, it was very lively. But as soon as it's dark, the only light source was from inside the house through the widely opened front door. The garage is dark. The front yard was semi dark. And then Maghrib prayer call started commencing. In Muslim countries, every 6:30ish p.m., our mosques will start a prayer call for Maghrib. You can look it up how it sounds like if you're curious. Throughout the Maghrib commencing, I still twirled around and sang with my heart out. Until, when during singing, I accidentally saw the tiny space between the wall and the parked car in our garage. I got chills right now recounting it just from remembering this, because I remember it very vividly. There was a woman with a tiny and slim-like figure, with her hair tied to a pony. It was one of my old maids, one that I was particularly close with. It was very, very dark, and that space in the garage was tiny. She was resting her body on the wall, not looking at me, and instead looking aimlessly towards the left side of our car, basically looking right ahead of her. But now that I was looking at her, she turned her head and looked at me. I kid you not, her eyes were gleaming red, and I know it sounds bullshit because I also always thought red gleaming eyes trope from blockbuster horror movies are not it. and cheesy and probably the most fictitious part of horror stories. But they were indeed red. They really were faint red, and I'm not sure if it gleamed per se, but they were shiny enough to break through the darkness and kind of lighten the space there. Gleaming is the closest word I can think to describe it. To be fair, my eyesight was really bad already as a 7-year old. I was already prescribed glasses then, and I wasn't using my glasses, so I kind of started to doubt that it's not necessarily my old maid. I doubted myself and started to wonder if instead this is just one of my current maids because the stature is smaller, the hairstyle, the slim figure. Both my maids at that time looked that way as well. Also, her face was not lit properly and I couldn't see her face clearly. It was a reasonable doubt. So I started asking her, Matt, what are you doing? And she kept staring at me and not answering. And it was just very scary after 3 seconds of her just staring at me. So I bolted to the front door right away, running my fastest. That is what we used to call a female maid. Immediately after getting inside the house, my mom and one of the maids looked at us mid cooking and basically just said, "What are you running like that for?" I answered, "Matt, were you the one that was in the garage minutes ago?" I know this doesn't make any sense, but I was a kid and was just scared as fuck. And we're trying to make sense of what was happening. My maid said, "No, I was still cooking with your mom." Me, "Where's the other Matt? She was outside." My maid, "No, she's upstairs, taking out the laundry. Why?" I immediately ran up the stairs, so fast I could have tripped. And there she was. I saw my other maid, taking out dried laundry. She looked at my panting self funnily and asked me what's wrong. I didn't answer and just ran immediately to my siblings, freaked the fuck out for the rest of the night. Something of the same nature has never happened to me in this house, even since. Now I actually think that this house is far from haunted, because nothing weird ever happens. Not even weird feelings or anything. Well, except for one time, but that's for another story. So, I didn't know what that was. I still don't know what that was. But while I already forgot 80% of any childhood memories of any kind, that one memory is still something I remember in detail. This was earlier this year. I moved to a different town and was finally settled in my new place. It was the night before Christmas, and family was coming by early that morning, so I spent the evening cleaning and prepping for the next day. All was well, I was in high spirits and crawled into bed. It was the first time I was hosting Christmas, so I was too anxious or giddy to sleep. I knew I should sleep soon, but I was wide awake. So I played on my phone a bit, just killing time. It was about 10 p.m. or so. Suddenly, I'm in the car with my husband on the highway, and he's pointing at something in the sky, frantically yelling, "What is that?" The next thing I know, I'm groggy and waking up, and there's lights around me and a dark shadow. And it feels like there's fingers pressing my temples and something is on my head. I vividly remember that feeling of dread and thinking, oh no, not again. And I feel groggy but manage to mumble and lift my arm, which was heavy, and try to say, I'm awake. I just closed my eyes and wanted it to be over with, and I remember thinking, I hope this doesn't last long. And suddenly, there's blackness and I snap awake. I'm drenched in sweat, and there are 2 points on my forehead that are throbbing in pain. I'm in my bedroom again, with everything as I left it. TV on, phone in my hand, and I'm thinking it's being a weird dream. Suddenly there's a loud noise and the power shuts off, leaving me in the dark. It scared the shit out of me, and I jumped up and tried to wake my husband, who was dead asleep. Finally, after a few seconds, power was back on, and my husband thinks I'm just silly. The thing is, I understand it could very much have been a dream. That's not impossible. But I'm not much of a dreamer, and if I do, they aren't vivid at all. This one felt so real, but why? And why aliens of all things? I'm mostly into ghostly stories, so don't read or look up UFO stuff that much. And I remember the physical feeling of dread that it was happening again. I could feel my stomach drop, and I felt sick when I thought, not this again. But I don't recall any other dreams or experiences like this. It's so random. It was Christmas, so I definitely wasn't thinking about aliens. So today I wanted to talk about something that happened to my family and I this past month. Because with what happened this evening, I have to share this. To be clear, I'm living with my two parents and my two youngest sisters. Everything started 1 month ago. It was 1 a.m., and I was listening to music in my bed when I overheard my mom yelling at me. The thing is, my mom always goes to sleep at 10 p.m., so there's no way she calls me, and indeed, she didn't call me. I first thought it was an illusion because it happens, but today, I'm not sure anymore. Then around 11 or 12 p.m., some nights when my dad and I were in the living room, we often heard many noises at the first floor. We were always accusing my sisters, but they were both in their bed, not doing anything noisy. Also, for many nights, I could use as many insect killer products as I could. There was always a horde of baby mosquitoes hanging around my bedroom's roof. My bedroom was clean like 2 days before the first apparitions. Yesterday, something really strange happened. First of all, I have to say that in my house, everything is noisy. The stairs, the guardrail on the first floor, the doors, everything. On our guardrail are always hanging towels, and yesterday we heard it crackling so loudly, and at the same time, a towel fell from the guardrail. So I went to see, and no one was there. My sisters were still in their bedroom, and as I told you before, if they rushed to their bedroom, we would have heard it. The only thing I noticed was that my 10-year-old sister always sleeps with her phone flash activated all night long, which was unusual. We then come to this evening, when my mom asked me to look after something in our freezer, which was in a room far from everything. I have to remember you that everything is noisy in my house. So I go in the freezer, but when I want to leave the room, I realize the room's locked. No one was there. The lock didn't make any sound, and the room can only be locked from the outside, so I couldn't lock it by myself. I then had to yell at my mom to ask her to unlock the door and then explain what happened. It was at that moment that we all gathered strange events that happened this month. I first shared all the events I've already explained, but my parents added two more things. My dad told me that one night he was watching TV and he got a really strange illusion where his dad, who died over a year ago, was next to him trying to talk to him. He freaked out, but before trying to understand, his dad disappeared. My mom told me that my 10-year-old sister was indeed using her phone's flash because these last days she was hearing very strange noises on the first floor while everyone was away at night, and she obviously was scared. We don't know what really happens and if there's any explanation to this day. I have to tell you that in my life I've never believed in paranormal or anything similar, but the past month makes me rethink about this belief. While this is a little odd, what really messes with me is that there's no swamp on this road. I know since I had taken this road many times on our trip to Alice Springs, a town in the middle of the desert. What should have been a red desert as far as the eye can see was all of a sudden a wet green swamp with big trees. No one in the car pointed it out. The family was acting normal, just dead silent for some reason. My little child mind didn't really care. My loud family was quiet because I was looking at the house on the side of the road, the house that wasn't going past. It looked like it was moving with the car somehow. Like a mirage, I think. This just felt normal to me. I didn't question it. After a few minutes of me watching it, I was finally starting to remember this isn't right. Why was no one talking? I started to panic, and all of a sudden, I got an overwhelming feeling that if I didn't immediately stop looking at the house and go to sleep, I wouldn't exist. It's hard to explain. I didn't think I would die, more like I would cease to be. It was incredibly hard to stop looking. It just felt right, but I knew it wasn't. The feeling of wanting to look at the house and thinking it was nice felt wrong, like it was just forced into my mind. My mind was split, one side in pure mental orgasmic joy, the other screaming to stop. You're in danger, I snapped out of it when my internal screaming forced the other thoughts out. I immediately closed my eyes and just waited in fear, after what felt like 20 minutes. I think I fell asleep as it was nighttime when I woke up. I've never experienced anything like that again, and I don't think I would win next time. Okay, so to start this off, I work at a family owned restaurant. I'm not going to give specifics as I don't want any harassment to track to the owners. As my boss and owner watched someone fly into the air before chaotically hitting the ground dead. It happened in a freak accident, but essentially a new restaurant was being built next door. Someone's screwdriver touched a live wire, causing a miniature explosion. It resulted in my boss's store catching on fire momentarily, but the fire department was close by, and it was put out relatively quick. It was gruesome, though. According to my boss, blood splattered against the windows, and his body parts apparently flung due to the explosion. I quit shortly after that, but due to a staffing shortage, my boss asked me to come back, so I did, about a year later. Since then, my boss's husband, who also works in the kitchen, says that some weird stuff happens. Today, I was working alone in the kitchen, and someone just quit, and I noticed some weird stuff. Rags I've placed in easy to reach places end up in others I can't even reach. Dishes got thrown around in the sink. I thought someone was over there, but no one was. I kept getting chills and feeling cold. Despite working in the kitchen as a cook, I cook mainly burgers and fried specialities. I'm going to try to get some of the footage from work, but it feels like someone is staring over my shoulder, and it makes it hard to do my job. Any tips to deal with the rest of my work week? Do you think it's harmful? It feels weird that so many people are quitting or asking to work nights or mornings, avoiding the afternoon swing shift that I work during. I moved back home with my mom a few months ago, and ever since I've been back, I feel like something is watching me when I'm in the upstairs hallway by my bedroom. My mum has always said the house is haunted by the previous owner. I'm not sure where I stand on that one, but recently I've had some experiences that are making me question things. On their own, these experiences can be written off, but they keep happening and it's getting a little weird. Sometimes I hear the stairs creak, like something is going up them, but not big enough to be a person. Other times, I've heard my door slowly creak open, but not all the way open. It sort of sounds like when my cat tries to get into my room. However, whenever these things happen, my cat is always lying on me or right next to me. Last night, I was walking through the hallway to get to my room with the lights off, and I honestly thought I saw my cat come out of my room. It was black, like my cat, and it was moving just like my cat. When I went to pet it, there was nothing there. I went to lie down and my cat was asleep on my bed. I've been talking to my brother who also lives with us and he's been having some similar, if not more intense encounters with a shadowy cat type thing. I don't know if it's just my eyes and ears playing tricks on me, if I'm going crazy, or if I'm actually being haunted by a cat. Is that even a thing? This happened back in early December of 2020. My grandfather had been in and out of ICU for almost a year. He wasn't doing well, and I was told by my mother to come in and to see him along with my grandmother. When I went in, my grandfather wasn't conscious. He hadn't been for a while, according to the nurse, but I still sat with him. I began to talk to him, despite the fact he couldn't respond. Meanwhile, my grandmother sat on the other side of the table, unable to hear me talk. She's mostly deaf. That's when the strangest thing I've ever had happen to me began. I remember that in my mind, a scene began. It was a white background with a single old wooden bench in the middle of it all, along with my grandfather sitting on one side of it, all dressed up fancy. He was in the same outfit that he'd been in when I took him for Father's Day ice cream. I sat beside him on the bench, and that's when I could see myself. I looked like a young boy no older than 8. He was confused at this, as I am trans, but I never told him. But somehow it became a scene like when we did go for ice cream. The white background shifted to a view of the waterfalls near my town. All the while during this, I could still see the outside world just fine. I could see what happened, but that world in my head was more important at the moment. I remember us talking a lot about stuff, such as my boyfriend, my family, reminiscing, but the biggest thing I remember him asking me was about how I looked. Bree, why do you look like a little boy? He asked me. I remember tearing up in real life and saying it out loud. Because, Papa, I'm Bryn. I've been wanting to be a boy for as long as I can remember. I was so scared to tell you. I've wanted to tell you since the first day, I promise. I never wanted to lie to you. I just wanted you to be healthy and happy. It was halfway through saying this that the vision briefly was interrupted, and in real life, he began to move. He tried to get up, though his eyes never opened, and I had to help him back down. After this, the white background returned, and slowly everything went back to normal. He appeared angry, but he took a few breaths to calm down. He looked at me and asked, "And does being Bryn make you happy?" I looked up to him, nodded, and again said, "It's made me the happiest I've been in years." He looked off towards the waterfall again and nodded after a few moments of silence. "I'm glad." We talked for a bit longer before the world before me started to fade away, with no real reason, and eventually it all stopped. He was still alive, but I think that he was getting too tired to speak anymore. After that hour and a half, I went back to my mother and left after everyone went in to see him. 3 days later, he passed. I'll never forget this experience. I asked my mother about it, as we are both gifted with ESP, and my mother did say my grandfather was very powerful. You could see glimpses of the future, even predicted my birth and name before my mother knew she was pregnant, and had been gifted with ESP as well. But he had kept quiet about it with the grandchildren. I don't know if that's what happened, that he mentally had connected to me, or if it was deathbed phenomenon. I don't know anymore. I had to share this with someone. When I was young, I would tell mother that people who have passed were in the room with us. I don't remember this. She told me about it. I was under 4 years old when this would occur. When I was a bit older, between 4 and 10, we lived in a house where I was constantly having experiences. Actually, we all experienced things. My mother would walk to the shadow figures. She assumed it was her father visiting. I should mention, he committed suicide in the backyard, but I don't think he was the only one there. For whatever reason, I had the hardest time sleeping as a kid. I would just lay in bed for hours. This is where I would hear male voices. I lived with all females and feel like I wasn't alone in my room. I remember one time hearing this deep, loud laugh that seemed to be coming from all directions. My granny would console me and say, "They can't hurt you," without me even telling her why I was scared. I'm 27 now, and I don't experience these things anymore. But I have personally seen children who seem to have communication with the other side. This incident happened on September 21st of 2017. I dug up some of the messages I sent to my wife about this incident so I could remember the details. So that's why I know the exact date. My drive to work is about 27 miles of mostly country roads. I left for work that morning like I always do, nothing special. About 10 or 11 miles into the drive, something in a nearby cornfield caught my eye, and I took my eyes off the road. I don't remember what it was, but something fairly mundane. After a short moment, out of the corner of my eye, I saw an old black car in my lane, and I'm pretty sure I even remember hearing the sound of its engine roaring. It was something like a 1938 Buick Special Sport Coupe. I'm not a car guy at all, but this is just what came up in a Google image search that looked similar to what I saw. So, like anyone who thinks they're about to be in a head on collision, I completely panic and slam on my brakes and no car. I look in my rear view mirror, and not only was there no black car, there were no vehicles around whatsoever. Not uncommon for this road, as it is mostly corn and bean country. I was left in what I'm going to call a what the fuck state for the rest of the day. Sort of a confused shock or something. But it got a little weirder. When I got to work, I eventually noticed my iPad battery had drained to 63%, which I took a screenshot of to show my wife. iPad batteries typically last about 10 or 11 hours with continuous use, depending on what the use is for, and potentially a couple weeks if it's not used at all. I would have had to use my iPad for around 3 or 4 hours non-stop to drain that much of my battery, and I distinctly remember unplugging it from the charger that morning. I asked my wife via text to check my charger was working, and it was. I checked the battery log to see if something was running that could be draining it, and there wasn't. According to my screenshots, 4 hours 57 minutes of usage since the last charge. 27 hours and 2 minutes on standby since the last charge. Okay, maybe it didn't charge, even though I do remember unplugging it. And the charger was verified to be working. Maybe. The incident eventually led my Googling to the phenomenon of time slips. There's a lot of alleged video footage of all sorts of paranormal encounters, but time slips aren't one of them. None whatsoever. So it seems like even in the realm of the paranormal, this is the least likely. As I'm a skeptic of the paranormal, even though it intrigues me, I decided to take note on my way back home if there was something that I could have somehow mistaken for a car. Well, potentially yes, but it's a bit of a stretch. Some repairs had been done on this road that were still new enough to be black instead of dull grey. I turned around to try to recreate the conditions of the events, but no, even using my imagination, it just didn't look like a car in my peripheral. Even if my mind misidentified it as a car, why would it go with such an unlikely car to be on the road? But it's all I had to work with, and even though I didn't explain the sound of the engine I thought I heard, that was the explanation I used. Until one random day on my drive to work, something caught my eye. About 12 miles down the road from where the incident had occurred, there, in someone's driveway, sat the same car, or at least the same style of car, I'd seen out of the corner of my eye that day. And it's still there. The owner never seems to move it. And it's in pretty decent shape, at least cosmetically. So, I don't know what to make of this. I've installed a dash cam since then, partly for general insurance reasons, and partly because if this happens again, I want to be able to rule out it was only in my mind.